Yeah. Hi, everybody. Today, would like to talk about the Xamarin Mobile App architecture, and there are like some interesting ideas about how to structure your application and then how to test it. Okay, let's go. Yeah. My name is Volodymyr. I'm working more than 9 years in .NET, and half of them is in Xamarin, and I'm one of the local user group organizer here in Ivano-Frankivsk. And today I would like to talk about what is mobile testing and my point to the application architecture. And as you may all know that we have like pyramids to test it, and a bit different pyramid based on my experience and based on apps that we usually work, and also about how we can build the test, and right after that how we can implement this in the continuous integration, continuous deployment pipelines. Yeah. Okay, let's start. Why users are not satisfied usually with mobile apps? As you may see here, like a lot of users do not like when the apps do not start, or they do not start, or the apps it's too slow to start, or if the apps do not work as expected, or the apps crash or returns error. And all this leads to that user just deletes the mobile app because it's just buggy in his opinion, and just go into another app. That's why mobile testing is very important, and especially because we have a lot of mobile devices. We have just Android, iOS with different flows, and we have, even for Androids, we have like thousands of devices. Sometimes it's quite difficult to test on all of them and to support everything. Also, another issue that it can be that users uses our application not only like when we use just one application, but in concurrent mode with some different applications. They just users like show, hide our apps, go to another app, or use it when there are like no or limited internet connection. That's why if we are working on some critical path of application, we should be sure that everything works fine. And if we just convert all of these to some business needs, we can see that depends on the time when we found the bug, what it can be the issue for the customer. For example, when we just find the issue on the unit test level before any release, even to the dev environment, it could be like less than 20%. But when it's after the post release, when the actual users find this bug or some critical bug, it's like mostly 90-95% of the issue. Yeah, that's why we need to test on real devices, not on emulators. And first of all, because the real devices does not have optional network condition, as I already mentioned, and they need to run a lot of apps at the same time. And yeah, they're also especially important for Android apps. Another option that many of the phone gestures can be simulated. That's why we couldn't test it easily like our just unit test. Also, if we are working in some third-party libraries or some very specific things, it's quite difficult to test them because they need some special type of hardware or something like that. Also, real devices are good for performance testing and for actual performance of our app. Okay. That's why, based on my experience, and just to make it very generic approach, I suggest that most of the time we can just split our application to like two most three layers, so like some business logic layer, some view logic that it's connects with business logic, and front ends. And especially with Xamarin.Forms, we can just have like one front end that is form both for app, Android, and iOS. But also, I would suggest to think about like third type of the front end. It's like fake app that looks the same for another all part as just as is, but it's possible to test. Also, I would suggest that normally if we do in this way, we just integrate API and some kind of storages or secure, unsecure, just database with our business logic. Yeah. And for example, I just made a simple to-do app just to show this approach. For example, we just have like core business layer. We have just core UI business layer that it can be implemented in any way of like it can be used like any framework like MVVM or MVP pattern or some other, and also like droids and iOS as executables of it. Yeah, and now I would like to talk more a bit the traditional pyramid of the how it works very often. And when it works, most of times we have like a lot of manual testing on the mobile apps, and we have very small amount of unit tests, some integration tests, some GUI tests if we have, and as I mentioned already, we have a lot of manual tests. It's even shown here as a cloud because it's not even possible to measure how much we have. We just have like everything to cover it by manual testers if we wanted to go to production, which is actually it's not good for continuous pipeline and frequent and stable releases. That's why that's why I suggest a bit different pyramids that it's wait a second, maybe I will just make it smaller. Okay. Yeah, and as we see here, like we have, and I suggest that we can add more integration tests, because if you have like very like not so difficult backend in mobile app, and it most of time it just calls from the UIs and processing on backend, we can just assume that everything it's a unit and we can test it from the start to finish. Also, after that, I would suggest to add some UI tests that cover like our actual page with our actual gestures. And I will describe how we can build UI test a bit later. Also, end-to-end test, also it's the UI test, but we cover everything from the, to cover like actual user flows from start to finish, just to be sure that our critical flows working. After that, we can have a bit less manual tests, but now we can measure how many manual tests we have and what they cover, and not much unit tests, just unit tests for some specific functionality, for example, like some calculations, and platform unit tests to cover such kinds as integration with third-party items or very specific cases with native lib integration. Yeah, and if you have any questions, you can ask right now, because I would like to go a bit deeper with every type of the tests and how we can implement them. Damian, Bogdan?
Not now.
No questions.
I'd like to hear more details at first.
Okay. Okay, let's go with integration tests. And as I already mentioned, if we build the, I'm sorry, in this page, if we build our architecture like in that way, as I already described, when we have like huge unit of business logic and view logic, and we have like just ins, whether it's like some clicks from the mobile app and outs like API calls or saving to some storage, we can assume that it's like the one huge unit. And based on this, we can just build integration or component tests, which looks like we just created the fake app that have the same pages as the normal app. And we have like tests that test it and invokes like fake app that works all things down. And just to be more practical here just a sample how it can be done. For example, we have an application that I already mentioned. And for example, we would like to test the login flow. And for example, if I'm just using the autofac in our application just to create any view, that's why I just mock several services that we use in our system, for example, and tell if somebody would wanted to use API service with that data that we sent it, just return that everything is fine and just call this login app, create it, invoke any needed actions in actual view layer, and then simulate the click as it would normally be done by the user. When the user just wanted to log in, he just needs to enter username and password and click login. And after that, I just assert that, for example, like the loader, first of time it was shown, then it was hide. After that, that we navigated to the root. And after that, the API service was triggered with the data that we already sent. Yeah, I can just quickly just jump it to this app if you need like more details and more insight what I mean here. But actually the idea it is like we have the actual app and some UI app, and it has like, for example, here I just used MVP pattern to connect the pages with presenters. And actually, like my even fake app, it just uses login page presenter to communicate with the view layer. And for this and this layer, it looks like the normal app because they work in the same concept of the interface declarations. And also it's also implements some sample services that normally it's like native ones. And for tests, we just, as I already mentioned, we create this page using all the logic and all the injections that we have in normal app, but just stubbing several items. Yeah, and here it just invokes the login as we would normally use from the normal applications. Because, for example, if like it just calling view layer process login.
Sorry, may you please open that login async? I just would like to understand how your MVP works inside, because it's not a common pattern.
Yes, but it's, I mean, it's not so important how does it work. I mean, in this layer, it's important that you just abstract your UI and business layer from the actual, like you have like view layer that is like core UI, and you just abstract the actual layouting that is, for example, done by wait a sec, I will just quickly open the Droid application just to show how it's connected in actual application. But the idea is here, you just abstract everything and you just, for example, in my real application, because it's just Xamarin native one, I just have this login activity that is my actual presenter, and I just wait a second. Okay, and I will just call from the login button. I just call also view presenter login async. In this, and it's like the same how I would do in the integration tests. I mean, like,
okay, now it's more clear for me, because with that fake app, I at first was confused.
I mean, like, you just separate the actual layout from your view logic, because view logic, if it would be the same for any app. It's like if you map the Xamarin native to behave as Xamarin.Forms, but with all native capabilities.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Wait a second, and as I already mentioned here, you just abstract all of these, all the view logic. Here on the Android and iOS, you just have layouts and just calls to this layer, and that's all. Nothing more this app knows about all of this. And this fake app, it would be for any part of code, this code would be as Android or iOS with no actual difference. Yeah. That's why if we do in that way, we can write a lot of code, because in my opinion, a lot of time we use this approach. And if we have like all this separation, we can just, I don't know, we can write a lot of code, we can mock API, we can mock some different states from the local storage, secure storage, and even cover like 80% of your application with all the flows. Because as we usually need in the application, we need just the whole flow. User logged to application, do something, and then log out. And you can do all of this just quickly in your integration tests. No needed for a long running test. Yeah, and and then we go with UI test. UI test, the actual test that we test actual layout. Because, for example, if our integration test works fine, it's great. But actually, we can do small bug in the layouting, and our screen wouldn't appear at all, or it wouldn't scroll at all. For example, if you have some button at the bottom of your page, but scroll is broken, it wouldn't be possible. That's why to cover this issue, we can write UI or end-to-end tests. And for both of them, I would recommend to use Xamarin UI tests or any other framework that can test Xamarin apps. And this framework is very good for Xamarin. It's written by them, and it's possible to test using this framework as native app and also hybrid app. And this is like quite easy to configure it. If you wanted to write it for Android, you just tell configure app for Android with this APK file and start app. For iOS, it's the same, but just pass to app. The only thing here is that to make it work with iOS, you just need to create a bit different bundle because of the way how the iOS can be tested. I will talk about a bit later. Also, as we have like tests that work with just one test for two platforms, it's also makes sense to create the same for UI tests, and also like the build pages that also work with the same. Also like work one test for two platforms. And actually, if we like build these pages in Xamarin.Forms or Xamarin Native, most of the time the behavior would be the same on both platforms. Yes, the buttons could be different. I mean, like for Android, it could be the fly out add button, like on Gmail app, and for iOS, it could be the plus button at the top of the screen, but the behavior would be the same. When you click on the plus button, you would have some possibility to create new item. Yeah, and I would just jump to the demo for a better. Yeah, and as you can see here, we have the app initializer that I already mentioned here, and we just here have the switch case that takes a different, that takes APK file or AOS and start it. And for pages, I would suggest to use page object pattern that it's used often in Selenium test when you describe your page as like as page with some elements. And as I already mentioned, we just as we can invoke this page for any platform, we just add switch case to be sure which elements to create. And we have like several methods in this page model to create. For example, when we wanted to log in, we can just tell like wait for element. For example, user input, just tap on it, enter text, tap another input, and just tap login. And wait a second, I will just quickly run the test and quickly run the app to show what it is. Yeah, actually it's quite easy app when you just needed to enter two fields and just press login button. Yeah, and after that you see the list of the to-do items that was created. Okay, and wait a second, I will just invoke the same from the tests. Wait a second. Okay, wait a second. I will just restart it. Okay, and then I will try to start from here. Yeah, as you can see here, it's already invoked by tests, and it's run all this logic. Yeah. Yeah, and as I already mentioned, yeah, you just write it in the way that, for example, we just need to logins and we just can go to some to-do list page, click on the add button, add title, and create item. I will just show you how it looks.
I have a question here because with unit tests, each test is independent, so it's not dependent of the result of the previous test.
Yeah.
With a UI test, when we have a complex flow, for example, third, fourth screen, should we go with some ordering of the tests, or we can just write each test independent as well? Because as far as I understand, here with a create new to do item, you one more time making a successful login with a login page, and only after that you testing a to do page. Yes, because I never write a UI tests.
Actually, because it's not a unit test, it's actual test that it's most of time it's done by your QAs, manual QAs, and they what need to do? They need to log in, they need to do something, and they need to save it and do it. Yes. When they wanted to see that some, yes, and when you wanted to improve your like time to deploy, you wanted to replace this manual work with some automation, because it can be like thousands of flows in your app, or like tens of flows that's needed to be checked. Yes, and it's not independent because they need to test all flow from the UI.
So, for example, if you'd like to test adding new element and removing one more element,
Yeah.
should we in each test add a login, or we can once login and then ordering first adding element, third test is removing element?
Actually,
What is the best approach?
Actually, it depends. If you wanted to have the end-to-end test, like, for example, to buy product flow from the login to logout, you can just write it in one test. Login, go to the catalog, set item, add to basket, uh, go to the payment flow, and then pay and log out. It can be just one test, but it would be end-to-end test that will have like a lot of benefit in your site, because you would check your critical paths. But if you wanted to, as I already mentioned, if you already write some tests that cover, for example, a lot of logic, your UI test can be just simple as start some page and check whether it's scrolled or not. And it's like different, depend what you want from this UI automation.
Okay.
Like,
Okay.
I mean,
So
like, there are like,
it's depend, but mostly as I understand, we would like to write a test according to some business rule. Yes. For example, if we have some ordering, that from beginning to the end, we write a one test that makes all that ordering process.
Like, it's just for your business and just for be sure that you do not broke something, because drawback of this test that it's long running task. The task can, I don't know, can take 5 I don't know, minutes or 2 minutes to run, but it has like some values. That's why it makes sense to create the small amount of this test. But as I already mentioned, for example, with end-to-end, you can just select the, I don't know, like 10, 20 flows to cover in your app full with all the logic, with all the API testing, because it just tests what it's do by manual QA.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
It's much clearer now.
Yeah. And and already, as I mentioned, we have like create the page elements, we have just create tests for them, and then we go to manual test. After that, when we have refactored our app to create a lot of like integration tests to be sure that a lot of code our works, then when we created some end-to-end tests to cover some critical flows that we will run on some basis, we have definitely some manual tests because it's not possible to quickly test everything that we built, but it will be more defined, much more defined than in usual approach when there are like no any other automation. Just test whatever we changed and make regressions for all other flow. Because yes, developers can tell that everything works fine, but from the QA perspective, every change can trigger a regression because it can be some database change and app cannot work as expected. But in this approach, we would have just much smaller amount of the manual testing that it will be more defined with their regressions list and some other like versions or like smoke testing or some exploratory testing here. Another part that I would like to talk that it's already unit tests, as you already mentioned, Bogdan. Yeah, it's very popular to write a lot of unit tests, but as for me, it's more okay for backend, for huge difficult backend. When we have the mobile apps that just call some other layers and just show on the UI show what's changed by user, I would suggest to write unit tests to some critical calculation or some other that is done on mobile app. For example, it can be, I don't know, some data that is stored or some other manipulation. But I'm not sure if it makes sense to create the unit test to cover each layer. Because, for example, if we split application to several layers, and you would need to cover in unit test, you would need to cover every service with unit tests, every model, some other stuff. And in actual, it's creates a lot of tests. And if you refactor or add new functionality, you would also need to change a lot of tests. But most of tests will be also quite simple. Some inputs, outputs, with a lot of mocks. That's why I see more value in just integration tests with mocking the actual user input and mocking the actual output rather than created thousands of unit tests. And another part that I also would like to mention is platform unit tests, because maybe somebody have experience to integrate with some native libs or integrate with some other libs or with some things that it's not possible to mock or test it without running the actual device. That's why it's a bit of pity of the QA time to test it every time, this functionality, because it's also important to work. That's why here I just wanted to show the sample of the platform test that, for example, test that some native library was expected. For example, if you use the Picasso library for getting images, it also would be good that, for example, if we use from the NuGet or we use from the other even our binding, because sometimes we just need to create the binding to some native library just to create test rather to test it manually. And here I use like special kind of the tests because it's just actually it's Xamarin Forms app that hosts a unit runner. and where they test all the functionality. Or for example, you have some specific logic in your database or something like that that would like to test it on actual device. It also would be good to use such kind of tests. Yeah. And as you can see here, it's possible to debug this code, and this code actually runs on actual emulator. Yeah. So one last thing regarding the testing and especially UI tests, as I already mentioned, it takes time to run all of them. And we would need to think about the parallelism, because if you just write it, I know, 100 of the test, it can run the 100 minutes at least. That's why we need just to make it better. And there are like several approaches to parallel them. First of all, just to use your on-premise machine and just to attach several real devices to the UI test assembly and just invoke them using an unit 2 or an unit 3 engine. But it's quite difficult thing, because you need to be sure that your device is clear, that all other version of this app is already deleted and new app is cleaned and installed without state, and it's quite difficult to manage actually. If you just wanted to make it on regular basis, you could spend more time than actual value on this. And another approach, it could be just cloud-based. And for example, there are like several different approaches, but one of the very popular for Xamarin UI test is just using Visual Studio App Center test. I will show it a bit later. I just wanted to quickly tell about CI/CD. There are like several CI/CDs that can implement the building application and actually invoking all your tests, because you just not only need to run tests, but also include them in actual build and release pipelines to be sure that your code is good and it's okay for release, and do not waste a lot of time on manual testing. There are like several options, and like TeamCity, Visual Studio App Center, and Azure DevOps. From the beginners, Visual Studio App Center is quite good. You can just build your Xamarin app in a minute. But for more advanced scenarios, I would suggest to use Azure DevOps, because it's has much more possibilities and much more features. Yeah, okay. And just to go to the App Center, I will just quickly show how it looks. Yeah, App Center, it's a quite good approach for apps. And for example, if you decided to push our app to several environments, we can just to create the apps for each environment there. And for each of them, we can just, as I already mentioned, we can just create the build, or we can just use the tests, actually running the UI test, or we just also can use it for releases. And definitely, I would recommend to use this App Center for crash analytics of your app. And not only crashes, but also analytics, events, logs, because it's much easier and it's well defined with Xamarin. Yeah. And for test, I will just quickly show that I ran all my tests that I show it today. I ran on the actual device. As you can see here, that my setting test ran for 12 minutes. And you can see how much takes for each test. Was it okay or not? And for example, if it failed test, you can see the screenshot of this device. You can see some details about this device. You can have to see some logs, why it failed. Or for example, here, you can see the logs that was true. Yeah, and you can also see some other information, what was involved, how it was run on actual device. And to make it run from the local machine, you just need to create the artifact from your mobile app. For example, I would suggest to use Signet app from our release build. And you just need to have your tests that it's all built from just Xamarin UI test project built it, and test cloud to publish it to the App Center test. And it's just a command from the App Center. You just tell us that we need to run the UI test, Xamarin UI test for this app that it's showing here with this kind of devices. Because for example, for each app, you can create the special devices, because sometimes we have the issue that some clients that complaining that some functionality not working on some special device. And here we have actual device. We can just go and create device set with that kind of device. For example, it can be like a Pixel, or it can be some other device with some special operating system. Also, we can create different test runs and test series like master or local branch for local testing. And we just put the path to the APK file, what series we want to invoke, what directory, and the directory to the test cloud access that it's just used for pushing this test to the App Center test, and the information about the authentication. And what's the advantages of all of these of tests? First of all, as I mentioned, unit test covers core business components. Platform unit test covers some critical native services. Integration tests cover mostly all app. UI test we use for checking UI behavior, just to be sure that this button can be clicked, this screen can be scrolled, and end-to-end use for checking all the app from the start to finish. And all of this works with CI/CD pipeline, because as integration unit tests are quick to run, we can run them on every pull request to the developer to be sure that nobody from our developers broke something. And platform unit test, UI test, we can run on before some release to production or some pre-release stage. And all of this goes to the frequent and stable releases to production, possibility to test our performance, and reduces the time for testers. And in general, improves our application and code quality. The only disadvantage of the Xamarin UI tests is just we need to have the special build of Xamarin iOS app with included this Xamarin Test Cloud agent. And yeah, but everything is fine. And just to sum up, don't think about the platforms, right? write tests, and yeah, one test is two platforms. Don't need to think that it's difficult. It's just easy, and yeah, and run your test in parallel. And CI/CD integration is a must for mobile project. Yes, that's all from my side. Any questions?
I have a question about parallelization. As far
Mm-hmm.
as I understand, if we will run UI test
Uh-huh.
within App Center, it will
Uh-huh.
parallelize it and start running in all devices in the same time. Yes?
It depends on your pricing, because as they use the actual devices, it's not a free service. It's paid one, and depends on your package. It can be just one device at a time, or it can be several devices per time. Yes, but it's still a trade-off. Whether you want it to be more sure and maybe you're working on some critical application, you would probably pay like several $100 per month, because there are like some individual and some how to say, corporate packages, but it still depends.
Okay, but you mentioned about the real devices. Can
Yes.
run UI tests with App Center with some emulators of the devices?
No, there are like
Possible?
actual devices.
Okay, only actual devices.
Yes. There are like, what will be the reason to run on the emulator? You can just create on your own machine emulator. Actual bugs
And
from
this
user
my
goes from
second
real
question.
devices. Sorry?
And this goes my second question. For example, I have a couple emulators or a couple real devices near me and would like to run unit tests on them. May I
You mean UI test?
parallelize it? Yeah, UI test. May I run it in the same time on a couple of emulators or devices?
Yes, but the only thing that you just need to create these devices and run for a unit using a Unit 3 parallel executor. Maybe you know that a Unit 3 has a parallelize attribute out of the box, but you just need to configure it.
Okay, cool.
Yes, it's possible.
It's cool. It's definitely something to worth to check in the evening.
Yes, actually, like any Unit 3 parallelizable, it's yeah, you have the possibility to create parallelizable attribute, and you would just to split your tests, but you should a bit more because like you can just run how to make it the most simplest way, how I did it before, when I just wanted to see the benefits. You just, for example, you can create the test like login test. You can just create that it's category 1, for example, like category login, for example, yes. And to-do list, it's, for example, like category to-do list. And then you can just tell the in-unit runner to create several several threads, one for category to do and one for category login. And in that way, you would split that. This configuration would just check one device for one category and second for second category.
Okay, and what about running the same test in the iOS and Android platform in the same way? Because here is it clear that we could run different tests in the same way, but what about run the same test, but in iOS and Android, I mean different platforms in the same way?
Actually, when you just run emulator, it just listens to it. For example, in the app initializer, you tell like use APK file and start app, but also you can just tell device IP or device port on what device you would like to invoke.
Okay, it's what I am asking about. Awesome
Yes,
that it is.
and this, yeah, definitely it exists, but it's still for local debugging. Parallelization on local machine, it's not going out of the box. You would need to spend a lot of time trying to make it, because it's not so easy to do. Yeah, if you just wanted to more details, we can discuss it a bit later, because I made it, but it's quite much more challenging than pushing it to the App Center. But
okay.
yes, but it's much cheaper.
But it's possible.
Yes, it's
most
possible.
Important. It's most important.
Yes, because definitely it's possible. Yeah, and for iOS, you can also run it on any iOS device. It's the same, or it can be emulator also. Yeah. Maybe some other questions?
Yeah, one question from me.
Mm-hmm.
So in our application, we are using Azure Active Directory to log in into application. And for that, we are using Microsoft Authentication Library. And no, I was wondering if you have any experience with writing UI tests that are, logging into application, which is, secured by Azure AD. Because from my understanding, this is some kind of separate, separate UI from the application itself. So I was wondering, if we can actually write UI test that logs user into Azure AD.
Actually, if it's like because as I understand, you still have external API. Yeah, the login is based on Microsoft AD, but it's still some external APIs that it's possible to access from any location. Am I right? Or
so
it has some, I don't know, specific, because if it's, most of the time, if it's possible to make it by manual QA without any VPN setup or some other setup, it's possible to do on App Center test. The only thing that VPNs and some other externals, for example, is not possible to test it, because there are no actual attachments to it.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, there are several limitations, but most of the limitation is some internal network or some other app specifics. If it's just the app that you just log in, even probably Facebook login wouldn't work, because there should be some pre-installed Facebook authentication here. But it's still, there are some points that it can be done.
Okay.
But most of the time, it's possible to automate most of the things. At least, for example, if it's not possible to do in Xamarin UI tests, there are some other frameworks, like Appium and native ones for Android and iOS. But Xamarin, it just most of the time is wrapper around them. Maybe some other questions?
So I guess there are no other questions. So Vladimir, do you have any links that you can share to the chat?
Not sure, actually, because it's just App Center and I don't know what else. But still, I would suggest to try it out like App Center and try it out the Azure DevOps, as it's quite good for mobile. And yeah. Also, I can make a bit different presentation regarding the actual build, how it can be done for mobile app, because there are some tips and tricks how to make it, especially in a big team.
Yeah, that could be interesting too.